Hi everyone! Welcome back to Think and Speak English. I'm Julia, and I'm really glad you're here with us today. Maybe you've been with us through earlier episodes, or maybe you're joining for the first time. But in any case, you're stepping into a slightly different space now.
And I'm Adam. Yes, today's conversation is still about spoken English, still about real life, still about human connection. But the level of reflection is going to shift a little. You might notice that the language feels more structured, and the thoughts take a bit more time to unfold.
This is episode 11, and it marks the beginning of our C1 series. If you've been following along from episode 1, you've already built an incredible foundation. You've practiced daily conversations, expressed your feelings, told stories, shared opinions, disagreed politely, explained your ideas, thought out loud, joined professional meetings, and even practiced persuasive speaking. That's a remarkable journey.
And now, at C1, we're entering territory where the difference between a good communicator and a truly impressive communicator becomes visible. It's no longer just about what you say. It's about how you frame what you say.
We're moving into that space between B2 and C1, where it's not just about correct grammar or clear sentences anymore. It's about how ideas are framed, how viewpoints are presented, how context quietly changes the meaning of what you say.
And that word, framing, is really the heart of today's episode. We're going to explore what it means to frame an idea, why it matters so much in professional and personal communication, and how you can start doing it naturally in English.
We'll share stories, walk through realistic examples, practice key phrases, and, as always, keep things at a pace that lets the language really settle into your mind.
So wherever you are right now, walking, commuting, sitting with a cup of coffee, just let yourself be present with this conversation. There's no rush. Let's explore this together.
All right, Adam, let's get into it.
So, Julia, before we start with examples, I think we should spend a moment on what framing actually means, because it's one of those words that people hear a lot but don't always fully understand.
That's a great place to start. So, at the simplest level, framing is about how you present an idea. It's the angle you choose, the context you provide, and the words you wrap around your message before you deliver it.
Think of it like a picture frame. The painting inside is your idea, but the frame around it, the border, the color, the material, that changes how people see the painting. Two identical paintings in different frames can feel completely different.
That's a lovely analogy. And in communication, your frame is everything that surrounds your core message. It's the introduction you give, the tone you set, the assumptions you invite the listener to share with you.
For example, imagine you want to suggest that your team should stop taking on so many projects at once. That's your idea, but you can frame it in very different ways.
You could say it directly. We're doing too many things at once, and it's hurting our work.
Or you could frame it differently. I've been thinking about how we can protect the quality of our work, and I wonder if being more selective about new projects might help us deliver better results.
The core idea is exactly the same, but the second version creates a frame that's about quality and being strategic, rather than about criticism and problems.
And that frame changes how people receive the message. With the first version, people might feel defensive. With the second version, they're more likely to lean in and think, that's an interesting perspective.
So framing is not about being dishonest or manipulative. It's about being thoughtful. It's about choosing an entry point that helps other people engage with your idea rather than resist it.
And at C1, this is one of the most important skills you can develop. Because at this level, people expect you to communicate not just clearly, but strategically. They expect you to read the room, to consider your audience, and to present your ideas in a way that accounts for other perspectives.
That's a big step up from B2, where the focus was mainly on being clear and organized. Now at C1, you're adding a layer of awareness about how your words land on other people.
And that awareness is what makes your communication feel mature, professional, and genuinely persuasive.
Let's look at some concrete comparisons between direct language and framed language, because I think that's where this really comes to life.
Absolutely. Let's start with a simple one. Imagine someone says, "This plan won't work."
That's very direct. It might be true, but it shuts the conversation down. There's nowhere to go after that.
Now, a framed version might be, "I'm wondering whether this plan accounts for some of the challenges we're likely to face in the second quarter."
Same concern, completely different energy. The framed version opens a discussion instead of closing one.
Here's another one. Direct version, "You're wrong about the data."
Or, if we look at it another way, the numbers suggest a different conclusion.
Both versions still say, "I don't agree." But the framed one gives space. It respects that the other person has a perspective too.
Another direct sentence. This idea is unrealistic.
Framed, it might become, "I'm concerned that in this context, this idea might be difficult to implement."
Or, depending on the resources we actually have, this idea might be hard to turn into practice.
Again, the underlying message is similar, but the framed versions are softer and more analytical.
And notice something important here. The framed versions aren't weaker. They're actually more precise. They include context, they acknowledge complexity, and they leave room for the conversation to continue.
That's a really important distinction, Julia. A lot of people think that framing means being vague or wishy-washy, but actually, good framing often makes your point sharper, because you're showing exactly where your concern lies and why.
Let me give one more pair. Direct. We should fire the vendor.
Framed. Given the recurring quality issues, I think it's worth evaluating whether this vendor is still the right fit for what we need.
The framed version actually carries more weight in a professional setting because it sounds considered and evidence-based rather than reactive.
And that's really the goal. When you frame your ideas well, you sound like someone who thinks before they speak, someone who considers multiple angles, someone that other people want to listen to.
Adam, do you have a personal experience where framing made a real difference?
I do, actually. A few years ago, I was working on a team where everyone was incredibly dedicated. People were staying late, taking on extra tasks, saying yes to everything. And the quality of our work was starting to suffer because we were spread too thin.
That sounds familiar. A lot of teams go through that.
Right. And I wanted to bring it up, but I knew that if I said, "We're overworked and we need to say no to things," people would feel like I was criticizing their effort, or worse, that I was being lazy.
So how did you approach it?
I thought about the frame. Instead of talking about the problem, I talked about a value that everyone on the team shared, which was quality. I said something like, "I've been thinking about something. We all care deeply about the quality of what we produce. I know that because I see how much effort everyone puts in. And I wonder if there's a way we could protect that quality even more by being more intentional about which projects we commit to."
That's a beautiful frame. You started with appreciation, you named a shared value, and then you introduced your suggestion as a way to strengthen that value, not as a complaint.
You mentioned commitment and helpful attitude as positive things, and then you add the new frame, focus and quality.
Exactly. And after that, if you later say, "So maybe we need to say no more often," it will land on softer ground.
And that's exactly what happened. People nodded. They felt seen, not attacked. And the conversation moved forward in a really productive way.
This is what we mean by preparing ideas before persuasion. At C1 level, you don't just say, "Here is my opinion." You build a frame around it so that others can step into it more comfortably.
And it doesn't have to take a long time. Even 30 seconds of framing before your main point can completely change how it's received.
I think that's one of the most practical takeaways from today. Before you share an important idea, spend a moment thinking, what's the frame? What value or context can I start with? so that my idea feels like a natural next step.
Let's talk about some specific patterns that are useful for framing at C1. These are structures you can practice and adapt to all kinds of situations.
I think one very useful pattern at this level is, the way I see it, X. At the same time, I understand that from another perspective. Y.
That pattern shows you are aware of your own frame and of others' frames.
For example, the way I see it, remote work has increased productivity for most of our team. At the same time, I understand that from a management perspective, there are concerns about communication and team culture.
That's excellent. You've expressed a clear position, but you've also shown that you've thought about how others might see it differently. That kind of awareness is exactly what C1 communication looks like.
The second pattern is, if we think about this in terms of, this one is powerful because it explicitly names the frame you're using. If we think about this in terms of long-term growth rather than short-term savings, the investment makes more sense.
You're literally asking the listener to put on a different pair of glasses to see the same situation through a different lens.
Third, one way to look at this is more gentle and exploratory. It doesn't claim to have the only answer. It simply offers an angle. One way to look at this is that the delay actually gives us more time to prepare, which could improve our launch.
Fourth, what I'm really trying to say is, this one is useful when you feel like your point might be getting lost. It's a way to reframe in real time. What I'm really trying to say is that this isn't about cutting costs. It's about investing in the things that matter most.
Fifth, and this is one of my favorites. Before we decide, I think it's worth considering. This pattern creates a pause in the conversation. It slows things down and invites reflection. Before we decide, I think it's worth considering how this change might affect the teams that weren't part of this discussion.
That's a wonderful one, Julia. It positions you as someone who's thoughtful and inclusive, someone who thinks about the bigger picture before jumping to a conclusion.
And sixth, I'd like to reframe this slightly. This one is very direct about what you're doing. You're openly saying, I want to change the angle. And in professional settings, that kind of transparency is actually very well received.
I'd like to reframe this slightly. Instead of asking whether this project is too expensive, maybe we should ask whether it's creating enough value to justify the investment.
That completely shifts the conversation from cost to value. With one sentence.
And that's the magic of framing. You're not changing the facts. You're changing the lens through which people interpret the facts.
Let's use it in a conversation about time and priorities.
Good topic.
And you're thinking, that's going to hurt quality and burn people out. But you don't want to be the person who just says no.
So you frame your response. I appreciate the urgency, and I think we all want to deliver faster. The way I see it, the question isn't just about speed. It's about what kind of speed is sustainable. If we cut deadlines now, but lose people to burn out in 3 months, we haven't actually gained anything.
That reframes the conversation from short-term speed to long-term sustainability. And notice, you didn't say, no, that's a bad idea. You said, let me offer a different way to think about this.
Then you might follow up with a concrete suggestion. What if, instead of shortening all deadlines, we identify the 2 or 3 most critical deliverables and focus our energy there? That way, we show real progress without spreading the team too thin.
And then the manager might say, that's a fair point. Let's prioritize together.
And just like that, you've shifted the direction of the meeting, not by fighting, but by offering a better frame.
I want to highlight something for our listeners. When you frame well, people often don't even notice you've changed the direction of the conversation. It feels natural. It feels like the conversation simply evolved.
And that's the sign of really skilled communication. It doesn't feel like persuasion or manipulation. It just feels like good thinking.
Let's try another scenario. Imagine you work in a company, and you've noticed that the way meetings are run is inefficient. They're too long, there's no clear agenda, and decisions rarely get made.
And you want to propose a new meeting structure. But you know that criticizing the current system might offend the people who created it.
So, how do you frame it?
You might say, I've been reflecting on how we use our meeting time, and I have a lot of respect for the collaborative culture we've built. At the same time, I wonder if we could make our meetings even more productive by trying a few small changes.
That's a frame that starts with appreciation and positions the change as an improvement, not a fix for something broken.
Then you continue. One way to look at this is that our meetings are great for discussion, but sometimes we leave without clear next steps. What if we added a 5-minute wrap-up at the end of each meeting, where we confirm decisions and assign action items?
That's specific, practical, and non-threatening. You're not saying our meetings are terrible. You're saying here's a small addition that can make something good even better.
And if someone pushes back and says, I think our meetings are fine the way they are, you can respond with, I hear you, and I agree that our discussions are valuable. What I'm really trying to say is that we might be able to capture more of that value by adding a little more structure at the end.
See how he used, what I'm really trying to say is to reframe in the moment. That's a recovery tool. When your first attempt doesn't land perfectly, you can use that phrase to refocus without backing down.
And that's such a valuable skill. In real conversations, your first framing attempt doesn't always work. The ability to reframe on the spot, calmly and without frustration, is what distinguishes C1 communication from B2.
Let's do one more scenario. And this one involves some tension. Imagine you're in a strategy discussion and a colleague proposes investing heavily in a new market. You think it's too risky given the current financial situation.
This is delicate because you're essentially saying, I think your idea is dangerous, but you need to say it in a way that doesn't damage the relationship or shut down the conversation.
So you frame it. I can see the potential in this new market, and I appreciate the ambition behind this proposal. If we think about this in terms of our current financial position, though, I'm wondering whether the timing is right. The market opportunity might still be there in 6 months, but our cash reserves might not be.
That frame does several things at once. It acknowledges the colleague's vision, it introduces a specific lens, financial timing, and it raises the concern without declaring the idea bad.
Then you might offer an alternative frame. One way to look at this is as a phased approach. Instead of a full investment now, what if we started with a small pilot, learned from it, and then made a bigger commitment once we have more data and more financial flexibility?
And your colleague might say, I see what you mean. A pilot could actually reduce the risk.
And now you've moved from potential conflict to collaborative problem solving, all through framing.
I want to point something out for our listeners. In all 3 scenarios, the person doing the framing never said, you're wrong. They never said, that won't work. They never directly attacked the other person's idea. Instead, they offered a different angle, a different context, a different question to consider.
And that's the essence of framing at C1. You're not avoiding disagreement. You're expressing it in a way that opens doors instead of closing them.
You're saying, let me show you what I see, not, you're not seeing clearly.
That's a wonderful way to put it, Adam.
Julia, I think we should talk about something that doesn't always come up in language courses, and that's the cultural and emotional side of framing.
I'm glad you're bringing this up, because framing isn't just a language technique. It's deeply connected to how different cultures communicate and how emotions influence conversation.
In many English-speaking professional environments, direct criticism is often seen as impolite or even aggressive, even when the criticism is valid. So framing isn't optional. It's expected.
That can be confusing for learners who come from cultures where directness is valued and respected. If you're used to saying exactly what you think, learning to frame can feel like you're being dishonest or weak.
But it's really not. In English-speaking contexts, framing is actually seen as a sign of strength and intelligence. It shows that you can manage not just your ideas, but also the social dynamics of the conversation.
And emotionally, framing helps you stay calm during difficult conversations. When you have a frame prepared, you don't have to react impulsively. You have a structure to lean on, and that structure gives you confidence.
I think that's especially important for people communicating in a second language. When emotions run high, your language skills can suffer. But if you've practiced a few framing patterns, they become almost automatic, and they keep you grounded even when the conversation gets uncomfortable.
So framing is not just about how others receive your message. It's also about how you experience the conversation. It's a tool for your own emotional regulation.
That's such a powerful insight. Framing protects you as much as it protects the conversation.
And over time, as framing becomes more natural to you, you'll notice that difficult conversations feel less stressful. Not because the topics are easier, but because you have a better way of navigating them.
Let's take a few minutes to go deeper into some of the key phrases we've used today, so our listeners can really internalize them.
The first one is, the way I see it. This is your go-to phrase for expressing a viewpoint, while signaling that you know it's one perspective among many. The way I see it, we should focus on retention before we think about expansion.
The second is, at the same time, I understand that. This phrase bridges your viewpoint with someone else's. It shows empathy and awareness. The way I see it, working from home is more productive. At the same time, I understand that for some roles, being in the office is essential.
Third, if we think about this in terms of, this explicitly names the frame you want people to use. If we think about this in terms of employee well-being, the policy change makes a lot of sense.
Fourth, one way to look at this is exploratory and non-confrontational. It invites people to consider an angle without forcing them to accept it. One way to look at this is that the negative feedback is actually giving us a roadmap for improvement.
Fifth, before we decide, I think it's worth considering. This creates a reflective pause. It's especially useful when a group is rushing toward a decision. Before we decide, I think it's worth considering how this timeline affects the newer members of the team.
Sixth, what I'm really trying to say is, this is your recovery phrase. When your first explanation doesn't land, or when you feel the conversation drifting away from your point, this phrase brings things back into focus. What I'm really trying to say is that this isn't about blame. It's about finding a process that prevents the same issue from happening again.
Seventh, I'd like to reframe this slightly. This is the most transparent framing phrase. You're openly telling the listener that you want to change the angle. I'd like to reframe this slightly. Instead of asking who made the mistake, let's ask what in our process allowed the mistake to happen.
That seventh one is particularly powerful in meetings because it redirects the group's energy from blame to problem solving, and everyone can feel the shift.
And eighth, from where I stand. This is similar to the way I see it, but it carries a slightly more personal, grounded feeling. From where I stand, this partnership has been more beneficial than challenging, and I'd like to find a way to continue it.
These phrases are like tools in a toolbox. You don't need to use all of them in every conversation, but having them available gives you flexibility and confidence.
And the more you practice them, the more natural they'll feel. Start by picking 2 or 3 that resonate with you, and try using them this week.
Let's also talk about some common mistakes, because understanding what not to do can be just as helpful.
The first mistake is overframing. This happens when you add so much context, so many qualifiers, and so many hedges that your actual point disappears. If you spend 2 minutes framing and 3 seconds on your idea, people might not even realize you had an idea.
That's a great point. Framing should support your message, not bury it. A good frame is usually 2 or 3 sentences, not a whole paragraph.
The second mistake is using framing to avoid ever stating your position. Some people get so comfortable with phrases like one way to look at it, and there are different perspectives, that they never actually say what they think. At C1, you're expected to have a viewpoint. Framing helps you present it well, but it doesn't replace it.
That's really important. Framing without substance is empty. You still need a clear idea inside the frame.
Third, framing in a way that sounds manipulative. If people feel like you're trying to trick them into seeing things your way, they'll lose trust. The best framing is honest. You're genuinely offering a different perspective, not hiding an agenda.
And people can usually tell the difference. Authentic framing feels generous. Manipulative framing feels slippery.
Fourth, not matching your frame to your audience. A frame that works with your close colleagues might not work with senior leadership. A frame that works in a casual brainstorm might feel out of place in a formal presentation. Part of C1 skill is reading the room and choosing the right frame for the right moment.
And fifth, forgetting to listen to other people's frames. Framing is not just about what you do. It's about noticing what others do. When your colleague starts with, "If we think about this from the customer's perspective," they're inviting you into their frame. Acknowledging that, engaging with it, is part of the conversation.
So framing is both an expressive skill and a receptive skill. You use it when you speak, and you notice it when you listen.
That dual awareness is really what separates good communicators from great ones.
We've been focusing a lot on professional scenarios, but I want to make sure our listeners know that framing is just as useful in everyday life.
Absolutely. Framing happens in friendships, in family conversations, in any situation where you want to express an idea while being mindful of the other person's feelings.
For example, imagine a friend asks you to go on a trip, but you can't afford it right now. You could say, "I can't go. I don't have enough money."
Or you could frame it, "I'd love to go with you, and it sounds like an amazing trip. Right now, I'm being careful with my spending because I'm saving for something important. Could we maybe plan something closer to home this time and save the bigger trip for later in the year?"
The second version protects the friendship. It shows enthusiasm, explains the constraint without shame, and offers an alternative.
Or imagine you want to tell a family member that you need more personal space. Direct. "Stop calling me every day. It's too much."
Framed, "I really appreciate how much you care, and I love our conversations. I've realized that I'm better at being present when we talk if it's not every single day. What if we set up a regular time twice a week for a longer, more meaningful call?"
Same need, completely different experience for the other person.
And here's the thing. Framing in everyday life isn't about being formal or stiff. It's about being kind and intentional. It's about caring enough about the relationship to think before you speak.
And in English, where so much social interaction depends on politeness, norms, and indirectness, framing is an especially valuable skill for non-native speakers to develop.
It helps you navigate those unwritten rules that nobody explicitly teaches you, but that everyone expects you to follow.
Before we start wrapping up, I want to acknowledge something. Learning to frame ideas at C1 level can feel exhausting at first. You're not just speaking. You're planning your words strategically, monitoring the reaction, and adjusting in real time.
That is a lot of mental energy, especially in a second language.
And some learners feel frustrated because they think, "In my native language, I can do this effortlessly. Why does it feel so hard in English?"
If that's you, please be patient with yourself. This is one of the most sophisticated communication skills there is. Even native speakers don't always do it well.
The fact that you're even thinking about framing means you've reached a very high level. You're not just learning English anymore. You're learning to use English with intention and awareness.
Unlike any skill, it gets easier with practice. The first time you try to frame an idea in a real conversation, it might feel clumsy. The 10th time, it'll feel more natural. And eventually, it'll become something you do without even thinking about it.
What I'd encourage is this. Don't try to frame everything perfectly all at once. Start small. Pick one conversation this week, maybe a low-stakes one, and try using just one framing phrase. See how it feels. See how the other person responds.
And if it doesn't go perfectly, that's fine. You learned something. You'll do better next time.
That's the spirit of C1 learning. It's not about perfection. It's about growth. One conversation at a time. As we slowly bring this conversation toward a close, I don't want to summarize in a mechanical way, but I do want to stay with the feeling of what we've been doing.
We've been walking around ideas together, not trying to arrive at one final answer, but noticing how the path feels different, depending on where you start and which words you choose.
And that's really what framing is. It's about choosing where to start, which angle to take, and which words to use, so that your idea has the best chance of being heard, understood, and taken seriously.
Let's go over what we've covered today. We started by defining what framing means, choosing the angle and context for your message, rather than just delivering the message directly.
We looked at the difference between direct language and framed language, and we saw how the same idea can land very differently depending on the frame around it.
We shared a personal story about framing a concern around shared values, and we saw how starting with appreciation and common ground makes the main point easier to accept.
We practiced 6 key patterns. The way I see it, at the same time, I understand that. If we think about this in terms of, one way to look at this is, before we decide, I think it's worth considering. And what I'm really trying to say is,
we walked through 3 scenarios: framing in a team meeting, framing a proposal for change, and framing during a disagreement.
We talked about the cultural and emotional dimensions of framing, and how it serves as a tool not just for communication, but for emotional regulation.
And we discussed common mistakes, overframing, under-committing to your point, sounding manipulative, not matching your frame to your audience, and not listening to other people's frames.
That's a lot of ground to cover, and if you were with us the whole way, you should feel good about that.
If there's one thing we want you to take away from today, it's this. Framing is not a trick. It's a form of respect. It's you saying, I care enough about this conversation and about you to present my idea in the most thoughtful way I can.
And when you do that consistently, people notice. They trust you more, they listen more carefully, and they're more willing to engage with your ideas, even when those ideas are challenging.
We're really glad you spent this time with us today. This was a rich episode, and if some of it still feels new or challenging, that's completely normal. Let it sit. Let it settle. Come back and listen again whenever you want.
Thank you for being here, for thinking along with us, and for continuing to push your English to a higher level. That takes real dedication, and we respect it deeply.
In the days ahead, pay attention to how other people frame their ideas, in meetings, in conversations, even in the news. Once you start noticing frames, you'll see them everywhere.
And when you're ready, try building a frame of your own. Start small. Start gentle, and see what happens.
If you've been enjoying Think and Speak English, please share this episode with someone who might find it useful. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is a wonderful time to do that. So, you'll be with us for what comes next.
In episode 12, we'll be exploring how to explain complex ideas clearly, how to take something abstract or technical and make it understandable for anyone. It's a skill that pairs beautifully with framing, and we think you're going to love it.
Take care of yourself, everyone.
And we'll talk to you again next time.
Bye for now.
Bye!